Hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. And today is our 207th Bible Decode. All of them coming from the New Testament. We'll be getting into the Old Testament later, but we've been trying to explore the ins and outs of the Roman origins hypothesis for the New Testament. That is that the Romans, the Caesars of the Flavian dynasty from 69 until 96 AD, were the true authors of the New Testament, and they wrote it as a weapon of psychological warfare against the Jews in their century-plus long battle with the Jews ever since the Romans took control in Judea in 63 BC. And the theory basically goes that they wrote the Gospels and backdated the story by 40 years, putting Jesus in the 30s, late 20s, early 30s AD. And then they also wrote a history of the war that the Romans fought against the Jews, which was kind of the culmination of all of the insurrections and revolutions that the Jews had staged over the century plus. And Vespasian and Titus, the two first father and son, the first two Flavian emperors, were generals for the Romans in that war, and they are basically the protagonists of the Jewish War, the book, the history that's called Jewish War or War of the Jews, written by under the name of Josephus. And whatever we know about Josephus, we basically know that he was an agent of the Romans, living in a nice spread at Caesar's palace, and basically being one of the court historians for the Romans. And he was also known as Flavius Josephus, an adopted member of the Flavian dynasty. Now, we've gone over all of the voluminous evidence for this: motive, method, opportunity as kind of circumstantial evidence, but then digging into the texts of especially the book of Luke and War of the Jews by Josephus. And we can recognize that whoever the author Josephus was, he is also the author of the Gospels. He or she or them is also the author of the Gospels. There are incredible amounts of parallels between the two books, and many of them were placed on purpose for your detriment if you believe in this, because they're mocking the Jews, they're ridiculing the Jews, they're dissing the Jews, and really, ultimately, they're trying to exterminate the Jews. Not, physically exterminate, but exterminate the entire religious tradition of the Jews. The Romans grafted themselves onto Jesus, basically by creating a series of prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament that are fulfilled in the pages of the War of the Jews by Titus, the Roman emperor, or soon to become Roman emperor, which includes the destruction of the temple at Jerusalem, which Jesus marked as a marker for his second coming. And so the Romans wrote themselves into the Jewish tradition as the second coming of Jesus. And many people knew about this all through the years, but it's kind of gotten lost. And now we think that the second coming is still coming. But it actually came, if you read Josephus's War of the Jews. But there are many, many other parallels, literally thousands of them, of the ones that we've even discovered, because there's only about 10 authors. 10 is a lot, but 10 authors who have kind of written from the perspective of the Roman origins hypothesis. And so if you want to learn more about that, go to some of the previous videos in this Bible Decode series. But right now we're looking at a parallel kind of book that kind of shows you the plausibility of the Roman origins hypothesis, but they don't quite take it that far. The authors are Rosemary Sheldon and Thies Voskuilen, and the book is called Operation Messiah. And in this book, they kind of make the argument that Paul was a spy for the Romans. And, what these various authors are trying to do is really to be able to reconcile the fact that Jesus does nothing whatsoever that is anti-Roman throughout the Gospels. And Paul is even worse than Jesus as far as that goes. But at the same time, they are both taking constant shots and resistance and excoriation of the Jews, especially Paul. And so they're looking at Paul and they're like, how can you explain a character like this? How can you be a Roman agent one day who's fighting against these Jesus followers and stuff to the point of persecuting them, and then have your epiphany on the road to Damascus, where Jesus as a spirit form comes to you and complains about his persecution, your persecution of him, and you convert to the other side. Well, all of those Roman agents that worked with you, your crew as a persecutor, they're not going to take that lightly. They're not going to just let you leave and switch over to the other side overnight. That's not really how that happens. And so there's just a lot of anomalies like that these other authors are at a loss to try to explain. And so they arrive at some imaginative theories about how this could be. And this is a kind of a partial reconciliation. They don't apply the way they talk about Paul and the way they explain him as being a Roman agent. That's why he's so pro-Roman and anti-Jew, and why he does various things, why he's always like starting little riots and, disturbances, false flag operations, and so on. But they don't really apply that same logic to Jesus. And that's, I think, where they fall out. But there's probably a lot of valuable stuff to learn in here just from the sources and the utilization of these sources, and also maybe being able to point out where they would have really benefited from the Roman origins hypothesis. we're in chapter 1 of this book, and we're just moving through this. So we're going to start here. The Gospel of John in chapter 6, verse 15 says, Jesus himself was afraid that the people might try to force him to become king, even if this was what he least wanted, to become king. Intelligence might have leaked back to the Roman authorities about what people were saying. So even though Jesus doesn't really do anything anti-Roman throughout the Gospels, he could still be a threat to the Romans because of kind of the collateral effects of his acts toward the Jews. They could cause a riot or definitely some type of chaos, and also whispering. And, you know, the Romans want to keep the peace. They want you to be docile. They want you to be, you know, part of their psychological operation in the Gospels. They want you to be a good citizen. They want you to be law-abiding and hardworking. You know, they want you, you know, to be obedient. And so even Christians today possess those qualities. They tend to be hardworking, law-abiding, you know, so they are good citizens. But that doesn't, you know, help as much when you live under such a oppressive regime. Now, Christians have tried to kind of counter some of that by inserting a kind of a more muscular Jesus, a more militant Jesus into, insinuating him into the kind of the creed. You know, they focus on like the overturning of the tables outside, in the temple, outside the temple, wherever that occurs. But that's against the Jews, not against the Romans. So it doesn't, it counts for, you know, Jesus sticking up for what's right or whatever, but not for fighting back against Romans. Okay. The fact that Jesus has operated for some time in the wilderness with a large following was in itself suspicious. Men who attracted large crowds in the Judean countryside, charismatic leaders who performed or promised miracles, practiced magic, and claimed kingship, invariably met a violent end. Even in later Christian propaganda, Jesus is seen as a figure of this same social type. Rome had established a clear and consistent policy of suppressing such movements and executing their leaders. From a Roman perspective, Jesus fits perfectly into this pattern. Pilate behaved with the pragmatic ruthlessness displayed so consistently by Roman officials in their dealings with people like Jesus, and which he would exhibit at other times during his governorship. His execution of Jesus was a purely Roman solution for dealing with a man who had been involved in seditious or potentially seditious activities. Those who engage in biblical conspiracy theories believe that Jesus was a political opponent of the Roman regime who used armed force to raise an abortive insurrection. According to these scholars, the Gospels were a huge cover-up of this story. The feeding of the 5,000 becomes an abortive insurrection. Jesus' counsel to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's was to these scholars a disguised call not to pay tribute. The cleansing of the temple was in reality a violent occupation of the temple by Jesus and his men, perhaps the very civil discord in which, according to Luke 23:19, Barabbas had been arrested. Now, he has footnotes for all these, so these probably would be interesting sources to look at. We need not, so once I get to the footnotes, I will. We need not stretch the evidence this far, even though there are some clues that after Jesus' death, the movement's remaining leaders had reason to fear execution. They fled to Damascus and various other places in the empire and were willing to arm and defend themselves or take the lives of opponents, like Paul, if necessary. It is, however, equally possible that Jesus' death resulted from poor intelligence or judicial error. In a country like Judea, with a large percentage of its population falling below the poverty line, it would not have been difficult for the Romans to find what Mesopotamian sources refer to as a mouth willing to talk. What matters for this investigation is not the literal truth, but rather how the situation appeared to the Roman administration. Even if Jesus were politically as innocent as the Gospels depict him, he was not regarded as such by the Romans. And even if Jesus' message differed substantially from that of other popular leaders, one wonders whether the Roman administration, with what little intelligence it had, was discerning or interested enough to recognize this. Okay, this section is called Political Revolutionary. The two men allegedly crucified with Jesus are explicitly described as lestai, L-E-S-T-A-I, which I guess is probably the Greek, although these authors have kind of made the mistake where they talk about the Aramaic, spoken Aramaic, and then they have to translate that into Greek, which is more just a red flag that the New Testament is written in Greek. That points to the Roman authorship of it. But I believe lestai is in Greek. So described as lestai, which we noted earlier could mean social, social protester, terrorist, or guerrilla fighter. Could it be that, like them, Jesus was a patriotic Jew who believed passionately in God's exclusive sovereignty over Israel? Might he have thought that he was commissioned to prepare Israel for its imminent enforcement? Though his attack was not directly against the Romans, it was against the Jewish hierarchy that collaborated with them. It was understandable then that he was executed by the Romans on a charge of sedition. Whatever Jesus' association with these rebels, he was certainly crucified by the Romans as a political revolutionary. Or the whole thing could just be fiction, propaganda. Very soon after Jesus' death, there were different movements of Jesus followers or Christ worshipers in different locations, all with different understandings of Jesus. Some of his immediate followers and his family formed the Nazarenes in Jerusalem, which did not detach itself from mainstream Jewry. They presumably had no sense that their support of Jesus constituted founding a new religion. This group mourned his failure to become Messiah as well as his failure to liberate the Jews. Perhaps they continued their political activities. In any case, in 66 CE, they threw in their lot with the rebels and were destroyed or scattered in 70 AD when Titus destroyed Jerusalem. This left Pauline Christianity as the dominant sect. But another faction would arise through the work of Paul and his followers. This version of Christianity became a mystery cult that welcomed Gentiles and presented Jesus to them as a divine savior in entirely non-political terms. The consequence of this view was a reasonably favorable but probably incorrect portrait of Pilate. The Pauline Christians depoliticized the Gospels, and responsibility for Jesus' crucifixion was transferred from the Roman administration to the Jews. Pontius Pilate's role was radically reinterpreted. Pilate has suffered much criticism for his role in Jesus' death, but we must not hold him or his intelligence sources to too high a standard. From the time of Pompey, the general who first took control in Judea, 63 BC, from the time of Pompey until the outbreak of the Great Revolt in 66 AD, Judea was a relatively unimportant place in the Roman world. The governors of Judea were generally low-ranking officials, mere equestrians of little note, who consistently displayed a general lack of sensitivity, tact, and knowledge of Jewish customs. Pilate, the most famous or infamous of them, was probably neither a monster nor a saint, but just another Roman bureaucrat of the type. He carried out his duty for 10 years without spectacular incompetence, but he was unable to avoid serious friction with his subjects. This worsened the relationship between Judea and Rome, and thus Pilate played a small part in creating the conditions for the Great Revolt. Rome's carelessness in choosing or monitoring its administrators in Judea cost dearly later on when the empire had to pay the price of putting down a major revolt. From the point of view of Rome's immediate security needs, Pilate had Jesus crucified for justifiable reasons. All groups act in their own self-interest and self-preservation. In the context of the first century occupation of Palestine, that meant nipping any revolutionary action in the bud. Like many decision makers, Pilate made a judgment on the basis of the intelligence he had at hand, even if it was fragmentary. Whether this threat to Roman security from Jesus himself was real or imagined is in some ways irrelevant. There may already have been an intelligence operation gathering information on a revolt concurrent with Jesus' actions, and Jesus simply got caught up in the net. The governor of Judea made a political and military decision for protection of his province. Like many modern decision makers, Pilate has become the victim of armchair generals who second-guess his judgment. He is not in an enviable position historically, being known as the administrator who crucified the man who would become mythologized as the center of a world religion. But neither Pilate nor any Roman administrator, even with the best intelligence, could have known that their decision would have such worldwide repercussions, especially for the Roman Empire. Now, what they don't really point out is that, their interpretation is not, it's not unanimous. Some churches, I believe the Coptic church or the Ethiopian, I don't know. Some church in Northeast Africa, I believe, Christian church, Pilate is actually one of their saints. So they give him credit for saying that Jesus, I see no fault in this man, or whatever he says, and that he washes his hands of the whole situation. And so even going back, way back to the ancient times, there were people who saw Pilate's actions as being worthy of veneration, as opposed to just kind of calling him a bureaucrat and he's just a pencil pusher or whatever, that he's just following orders and trying to, keep a low profile or whatever, so he doesn't raise the ire of Rome. So, not to say that that's true, but just to say that they should have at least mentioned that as kind of a point of contention, as opposed to kind of presenting it as if it was axiomatic. We shall examine in the following chapters whether this new otherworldly interpretation of Jesus' message was the survival technique of a persecuted minority or a well thought out plan by Paul and the Roman establishment. His work would change a Nazarene movement hostile to the Roman Empire into a pacifist movement that counseled obedience to Rome. Later evangelists could afford neither to recognize Jesus' revolutionary activities nor to lay the responsibility for his death on the Romans. And certainly that's true. If you don't want to, get fed to the lions, you don't want to, get the Romans angry, especially for, so that's kind of what they're saying. They're saying that this more pacifistic version of Jesus is a later rewrite of the Gospels in order to make them less objectionable to the Romans. To me, though, it seems like a lot of contortions, and that if you just went directly to the idea that it was authored by the Romans and the whole thing is fiction, Paul is fiction, Jesus is fiction, maybe based on characters who existed, but the Son of God and the Immaculate Conception and the crucifixion and resurrection did not happen, and they are just borrowed from pagan sources, all of which are in the much earlier sources, whether it's coming from Egypt or from Persia or from Samaria. So that is the end of the chapter. Now the footnotes here are pretty voluminous, and I couldn't possibly read these as part of the video, but there's over 100 footnotes just in that first chapter. But the next chapter is called The Mysterious Saul of Tarsus. And this is actually chapter 3. I said it was chapter 2, but chapter 3, The Mysterious Saul of Tarsus. We'll try to get started with this here. In order to understand his actions, we must know something about origins of the man we call Saul of Tarsus. Unfortunately, his origins have been obscured by Saul himself, and discrepancies in the story have been the subject of numerous biographies. What these studies have brought to light is that there is no scholarly agreement on any aspect of Saul's background. Traditional lives of St. Paul have been based largely on Acts, because Saul's own letters illuminate his character, his religious experience, and his thought. They make very few references to his career. Most traditional biographies of Saul contain the same three biographical touchstones. He was a Pharisaic persecutor of the church. He had a conversion experience on the road to Damascus, and he was a Christian missionary to the Gentiles. These define the persona of Paul in the popular conception. Surprisingly, however, we do not have reliable evidence for any of these facts, so-called facts. For his pre-Damascus life and his conversion experience, we are dependent on Saul's own retrospective accounts written years later and redacted later still. While Acts is the most ancient narrative on the earliest period of Christianity's development and expansion, there has been a growing recognition in recent decades that Acts has some major deficiencies as a dependable source for Saul's life. Probably because it is entirely fiction that has a lot of the stories and a lot of the verses in the book of Acts, as well as the rest of the New Testament, are in there in order for them to be parallels to something that's going on in War of the Jews. And it's all part of a code that is incredibly intricate and complex. If you look at Michael Menescott's work, which I did in its entirety in the earlier videos, he shows in the book of Luke there are over 250 parallels with Josephus's War of the Jews. And if you take those parallels and graph them on a chart using the book of Luke on the vertical axis and War of the Jews on the horizontal axis, putting a dot every place that there is a correspondence, they form 5 almost perfect letters of the same size in Latin. APTVS, Titus Vespasian, and something else, someone else, or maybe 3 other people, or whatever. But the basic gist is that the Romans actually took enough time to set up the whole, obviously they had complete control of both of those sources, both the book of Luke and Josephus, and to actually take all the time to put the parallels in exactly the right places that they needed in order to sign their initials to the book of Luke, so that a person who discovers it 2,000 years later can be very confident that they had that intention. In the end, even if we can convince ourselves of our ability to extract very reliable information